Okay, good evening, everyone. It's on one hand, it's wonderful to be with all of you because it's just wonderful to be with all of you. But obviously, we gather today under somewhat challenging circumstances. Things, this is, as they say, if 2020, if who would have thought 2020 could have got any worse? I mean, just a shocking year. And uh, to receive the news last week that Rabbi Sacks, as I've mentioned many times, and there's no secret to any of you. I mean, he is the most important voice in the Jewish world today, without a doubt. Speaks with a clarity and an authority and a wisdom that's unparalleled. And so to hear that he is unwell is a very, very challenging thing. And obviously, which is why we have gathered this evening to, we've answered the call. I mentioned Yeshiva University put out a call to have a global day of prayer and of learning. And so we had said a Mishnah Berach this morning in Shul for Rabbi Sacks, and we're going to learn together. We're going to learn a little bit, and we'll do it Refua Shelemah, for the complete healing of Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba. May he receive a Refua Shelemah. And we know his work is not done here. We need a lot more. We need his voice, and so I think I mentioned in the email. I don't know if this is accurate, but as you might have seen the post by Rabbi Alex Israel, who spoke about how in the past Rabbi Sacks has not spoken about his illness, his illnesses that he's faced in the past, and that's a powerful post, and I posted it for those of you who get our newsletter or on Facebook. But the fact that they are disclosing at this time leads us to believe that this is a serious situation, and so as such, we are coming together to do some learning. And I thought of, I've wanted to get my dear friend, Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens. That's how you have to call him, Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens, right? That's the official title. I've wanted to get him for a very long time. He came out to Melbourne a couple years ago. Scopus brought him out and was a very popular teacher. And I wanted to get him for a long time in some capacity for our shul. And then when this happened, and very quickly on very short notice, he agreed to join us this evening and learn some of what Rabbi Sam considers some of his most powerful teachings, or something that speaks to him. You will have seen the very long and impressive biography CV that Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens. There's got to have some other honorifics at the end there. Get working there, Sam.
Rabbi Sacks has many more.
That's right. We got to get you knighted. Come on. What are you doing? So you will have seen he's a very impressive young man who is able to bridge together these really interesting worlds of academia, philosophy, Torah, halacha, Kabbalah. I mean, just, an incredible range of wisdom and insight, and also a dear friend who, unfortunately, with the passage of time, we haven't been able to hang out much over the past couple of years. I've been so far away in Melbourne, but we learned together in Yeshivat HaMivtar together back in the old days, a very, very special time. And so it's really, really special to have you, Sam. I hope Sam's okay, among friends. It's such a pleasure to have you here. But again, we wish it was under different circumstances. And I'm so glad that you could join us for such a powerful, important initiative. And so once again, we're going to learn some Torah together. The Refua Shelemah for the complete healing of Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And so, Sam, it's really a pleasure to see you and an honor to have you with us. And take it away.
Thank you so much. Rav Noam, if you could make me a co-host, I'll be able to share my screen. I have a handout that people can read along with me.
I'm going to make you co-host. And I'm also just going to remind everyone that although you can unmute yourself, there might be times in which you can ask questions. But if I could just ask you to stay muted throughout the duration until Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens asks you to to ask some questions. But of course, please, if you do have questions, please utilize the chat box as well. So you should be co-host there.
Great. Thank you
Whenever you're
so
ready.
much, Rav Noam. And I just want to echo something you said. I mean, it is obviously a very tragic that this is the sort of situation that brings us together. But having said that, I am glad to have been brought together with the community in Melbourne and with you, Rav Noam, a dear friend, and a rabbinic thinker and personality that I think Melbourne is very lucky to have, blessed to have. He doesn't know this, but most Friday afternoons before Shabbos comes in, we're listening to his alto jazz ensemble, and it lifts us into the spirit of Shabbos. So I want to speak to you today about some of the ideas that Rabbi Sacks has bequeathed to us, and in particular have had an influence over the way that I think and the way that I work in the philosophical projects that I've been writing and thinking about. But first I want to tell you a little bit about some personal background about Rabbi Sacks and I. And maybe that can help to illustrate the extent to which his very presence here in our midst, in our generation, is of unquantifiable value. When I first went to yeshiva after high school, I was 18 years old, and I won't say which yeshiva I went to because I'm going to say something not all that nice about it. I didn't have a great time, and I felt intellectually bullied. I thought people were being closed-minded, but it was the only introduction I'd really had to formal Jewish learning. I hadn't gone to a Jewish high school or anything like that. And I felt desperately lonely. And I wrote an email to Rabbi Sacks asking him for his advice. Should I leave yeshiva? What should I do? I felt claustrophobic with all of this closed-mindedness around me. And he didn't know me, and he didn't respond for a few weeks. So I thought he just wouldn't respond. I mean, you write an email to somebody like that, a big personality, and you don't always expect to get an answer. And I think it was a few months later, he wrote to me a very long and very heartfelt email, just encouraging me to persevere. He spoke about the fact that when he was a young man, he bought an airplane ticket to America, and he bought a Greyhound bus ticket that allowed him to go, wherever he wanted in the States by bus. And he sought out the religious leaders who he had heard of, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, like Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Hutner, a number of great American thought leaders, and he sought them out and he went to speak to them, and he encouraged me to do that from my base in yeshiva, to go and meet Rabbi Lichtenstein, to go and meet other great individuals, and he encouraged me to persevere in what has really become my life project of reconciling a worldly, philosophical, academic outlook with religious commitment. And it wasn't the only time in which I reached out to him personally. And I think that if it hadn't been for his demut, his image, his example, my journey would have been a much more lonely place, and perhaps I wouldn't have even had the motivation to continue, because you feel like you're following in the footsteps of somebody great who's done it, who assures you that the path is a kosher path, a good path, a worthwhile path. And I'll tell you one other thing that very much inspires me about Rabbi Sacks, and it's a little bit corny and slushy, but it's true. And it's the very great and public love that he has for his wife Elaine. And I remember that when I got engaged, I went to speak to Rabbi Sacks, and it's best told in contrast with another story. So another rabbi had said to me, a rabbi is very dear to me, but he's a very complicated person. And he said, "Oh, you're getting married? Enjoy the beginning." He says, "Marriage is like a long bath. It's a really hot, lovely bath. You get into it. It's so comfortable. It's so nice. But it gets colder and colder and colder. But the only problem is when it's really, really cold, you can't get out because you'll be freezing. And I was like, thanks. I'll enjoy my marriage. Thank you, Rabbi. But when I saw Rabbi Sacks, he said to me, he said, you know how great it is now that you're engaged and you're in love and the kind of the beginning of a relationship? He says, it can stay that way forever. It really can stay that way forever. And he, in his relationship and his love for Elaine, has kind of role modeled that to me and my wife as well. Anyway, I want to share with you a little handout here. So I'm going to share screen. 1 second. Okay, can people see this? Okay, so I want to share just a number of different themes that emerge in the work of Rabbi Sacks that have been meaningful or important to me, and or seem to be distinctive in terms of the contribution that Rabbi Sacks has made to Jewish thought. One of the things I want to talk about, and this is the first theme, emerges in his book of 2005, I think it was, To Heal a Fractured World. And he cites the following source from Masechet Gittin, from the Babylonian Talmud. Although this is an older source, it's a Tanaitic source that the Talmud is quoting. And it says the following: Ein mamchin biyad ani, we don't protest against a poor person, nacharim, of the non-Jews, when they come to glean gleanings in the field. There's a mitzvah in Judaism when you're harvesting, you leave certain parts of the harvest for the poor. And the idea is they're really there for the Jewish poor, for your brethren, but you don't protest if a non-Jew comes to take them. Why? Mipnei darkei shalom, because of the ways of peace. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis teach, Miparnasim ani necharim im anei Yisrael, we provide for the needs of the poor non-Jews alongside the needs of the poor Jews. Umavakrin cholei necharim im cholei Yisrael, we visit the unwell non-Jews alongside visiting the Jews. So when you go on your rounds around the hospital to cheer up the unwell, you don't just go and visit the Jewish beds, you also go and visit the non-Jewish beds. The kovrin metei necharim in metei Yisrael, we also bury the dead non-Jews, just like we bury the Jews. So if a non-Jew needs burial and there's no one to take care of their last rites, so to speak, we do that for them. Mipnei darkei shalom, because of the ways of peace. Now, this has been understood in a number of different ways, this notion of the ways of peace, this rabbinic notion that when you do things for the vulnerable or the poor in your community, you should do it also for the vulnerable and the poor in the wider community, for the non-Jewish community. This is the rabbinic notion of darkei shalom. Now, this notion stands at odds somewhat with biblical presentations of the relationship between the Jew and the non-Jew. It seems like, according to the Bible, we only really have an obligation to look after non-Jews if they commit to renouncing, for instance, idolatry. If they become a ger toshav, which means a resident alien, they don't have to convert to Judaism, but they at least have to accept certain basic theological and religious truths before we're going to be willing to extend to them the sort of care that we're talking about here in Masechet Gittin. But as is widely understood, and indeed I could have brought this source as well, it's explicitly stated in Masechet Avodah Zarah, the principle of darkei shalom comes with no strings attached. You don't say, oh, we visit the sick Gentiles, but first we give them a quick theological questionnaire to make sure that they're at least sufficiently monotheistic. No, we visit them come what may. We don't just bury the dead non-Jews who pass some sort of theological test. We bury non-Jewish dead people. And we do it out of the kindness of our hearts. We do it mipnei darakei shalom. So there's a tension between, so to speak, the biblical presentation of Jewish non-Jewish relations and the rabbinic presentation of Jewish non-Jewish relations. And one way you could try to reconcile the differences is as follows. You could say, well, look, this is just this is wise rabbinic social policy. In the days when the Jews had sovereignty over the land of Israel, and when we weren't vulnerable, and when we didn't have to worry about oppression and anti-Semitism and whatever, and we got to dictate terms, in those times, then of course we're not going to care about the downtrodden among the non-Jews unless they step up to the plate and at least accept monotheism, for example. But because we're now exiled and we don't have power and we don't want to encourage anti-Semitism, we better make sure to seem as if we care. We must at least make it seem as if we care about the vulnerable among the non-Jews. And that's what Darkei Shalom is, according to this suggestion. Well, in the book, To Heal a Fractured World, Rabbi Sacks makes it a powerful case for a different reading of these laws. And he says the following. He says there are laws in Judaism which are designed to minimize conflict between Jews and non-Jews. But those laws are not called Darkei Shalom by the rabbis. Those laws are called Mipnei Eva, because of hatred. We don't want to stir up hatred, so there are certain things the rabbis tell us not to do, Mipnei Eva, not to stir up hatred. But these laws, the ones we're looking at now in Gittin, the rabbis don't say we do this Mipnei Eva. It says we do this Mipnei Darkei Shalom because of the ways of peace. And then Rabbi Sacks makes a beautiful distinction between peace and the ways of peace. And he says, do you know what? In biblical times, when there are miracles left, right, and center, when God's prophet can summon down a fire on Mount Carmel that instantaneously accepts his sacrifices, in days of miracle, you can kind of say that local non-Jews who don't accept the basic theological teachings of Judaism are blameworthy because there are open, overt miracles. So the prophets have this notion of peace, shalom, which comes Bayom hahu yiyeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. On that day when everybody recognizes that God is one and his name is one, and everyone will recognize it because it will be clear as day because of the great miracles of the Messianic age. Sure, in that time, people might be culpable for not accepting basic tenets of Judaism, but and that is the time of shalom. But we don't live in that time. We live in a time when people are not blameworthy for not knowing the truths of Judaism. God's face is hidden. And therefore, right now, shalom, peace, it's not attainable. But Darkei Shalom is attainable because the main thing, the primary interest of the rabbis is that we should love one another. Not just Jews, but human beings should love one another. Sure, in a time when the truth of Judaism is clear to everybody because of open and overt miracles, then it might be reasonable to condition some of your help upon people, accepting what's blindingly obvious. But until that time, that would be the wrong thing to do, because love and care and human dignity are more important than the accidental errors of people who don't share our beliefs in this time of God's hiddenness, in this time of Darkei Shalom. And he goes further and he says, look, why did they call it Darkei Shalom? Where do those words come from? And he points to Proverbs 3. In Proverbs 3, and this will be well known to you from the liturgy, where we put the Sefer Torah away, the prayer that we say when we put the Sefer Torah away, quotes from this proverb that says, Darcheha darchei noam. Her ways are ways of noam, pleasantness. V'chol nativoteya shalom. So you have there in that verse, darchei and shalom, right? Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all of her paths are peaceful. Eitz chaim hi lemachazikim ba. It's a tree of life to those who hold dear to it. V'tamchea mu'usha. And those who cling to it are happy or praiseworthy. Beautiful. What Rabbi Sacks wants to teach us from here is that this verse is about the Torah itself. So, mipnei darkei shalom, the policies here in Masechet Gittin, they're not some, afterthought that the rabbis kind of tack on to Judaism. They are the heart and soul of the Torah itself, whose ways are ways of peace. So, what I think Rabbi Sacks helped us to do in To Heal a Fractured World is to definitively put to one side the more xenophobic or quietistic or inward-looking, introverted readings of the Jewish sources, and to force into center stage a conception of Judaism that doesn't allow the Jew to ignore the plight of the non-Jew. And he did it in a way that's deeply rooted in the sources. And sometimes, Rabbi Sacks's detractors to the right would say, oh, he's a very good spokesperson, but he's not yeshivish. He's not a big Talmud Chacham. He's just a very good kind of public intellectual. But if you study the sources that are informing his reading of Darkei Shalom, and he's following the Ritva in Gittin, one of the main Rishonim, one of the main medieval commentaries of the Talmud, you see that behind the beautiful presentation and the poetry and the passion and the ethical vision, there's deep and meaningful scholarship that forces, I think, a more backward, inward-looking or xenophobic Judaism onto the back foot. And for that, I was very, very grateful to him as an Orthodox Jew who cares about, quote unquote, progressive causes, who cares about the plight of the refugees, who cares about the non-Jewish poor, who cares about, the non-Jewish vulnerable. Rabbi Sacks was there to say that this is central to the Jewish vision. In fact, it's the very lifeblood of the Torah, whose ways are ways of peace. So that was the first theme I wanted to concentrate on. Anybody have any questions they'd like to raise before I move on to the next? Maybe Noam could take a look through the chat, and and he can interrupt me if a question emerges. Okay,
So again, feel free, if you do have questions that come up, then feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll
yeah, Noam will keep an eye out for them.
Sure.
So the next thing I want to look at, and this is going to touch upon one of the most controversial things that Rabbi Sacks ever wrote, which was The Dignity of Difference in 2001. But the quote I'm going to look at, which I think helps to shine a light upon that controversy, is a quote again from To Heal a Fractured World. He has this idea, Rabbi Sacks, that Judaism is inherently what he calls a future-oriented faith. And he thinks that this stems from the fact that Judaism doesn't believe that the Messiah has come. And he contrasts this explicitly with Christianity, because the Christian, in some sense or other, has to look around at the world in which we live and say that it's already somehow saved. And Judaism, according to Rabbi Sacks, is a dogged refusal to look at this world and say that it has been redeemed, because redemption lies in the future, not in the present. This is what hope is in Judaism, says Rabbi Sacks, a refusal to give up on your deepest ideals, but a refusal likewise to say, in a world still disfigured by evil, that the Messiah has yet come and the world is saved. there is work still to be done. The journey is not yet complete, and it depends on us, who now all too briefly stride upon the stage of time. Now, in a nutshell, Rabbi Sacks got in tremendous trouble in 2001 for this book, The Dignity of Difference, which in its first edition had phrases like, Judaism is the language in which God speaks to the Jews, Islam is the language in which God speaks to the Muslim, and Christianity is the language in which God speaks to the Christian. He came out with a second edition in which he, in the preface, urged his readers to recognize that he hadn't actually changed his mind, but that he felt he had been misunderstood, and that he felt he was able to express the very same ideas in language that would be less inflammatory, and that's what he did in the second edition. But I want to explain what I think is going on here in Rabbi Sacks's attitude towards the truth of Judaism and the legitimacy or validity of other religious perspectives. And there's another a quote from The Dignity of Difference, which remained in the second edition. He said, truth, so to speak, with a capital T, resides only in heaven. On earth, we have only truths with a lowercase t. And I think that what he's alluding to is a Kabbalistic doctrine of Shvirat HaKelim, which is that when God created the world, or at least after the sin of Adam and Chava in last week's Parsha, in Parshat Bereshit, there was a sort of a fracture such that God's divinity got, so to speak, this is metaphor within metaphor, got fractured in such a way that little sparks of divinity got hidden all over the world. And even in the darkest, most unholy seeming places, there are sparks of divinity to be captured, to be restored. And part of the job of the Jew who does mitzvahs is to elevate those sparks of divinity in order to create some sort of unity that existed in the past, that existed before creation. This is this idea that truth with a capital T, the unified truth, the whole truth, is something heavenly. Down here in the world, however, this world of imperfection, this world in which God's face isn't yet totally revealed, this world in which God's face is still hidden, we only get kind of glimpses and sparks of the truth. And our job is somehow to find a way of uniting them, of putting them together. Now, in the book that I just wrote called The Principles of Judaism, one of the things I try to make sense of is this peculiar tendency among medieval Jewish philosophers to say lots and lots and lots about God. God is the creator, God is the first cause, God is wise, etc., etc. And also to say, in the very same books often, oh, by the way, you can't say anything about God, right? So you have this thing called negative theology. But in the very same books where Rav Saadia Gaon and Maimonides advocate for negative theology, this view that you can't say very much about God, in fact, you can't really say anything about God, in the very same books, these very same rabbis say lots and lots of things about God. And in fact, it's only because of the things they say about God, it's because he's the creator, it's because he's beyond us, it's because he's so transcendent and supernal, that's why we can't say anything about him. But you said loads of things about him. And in fact, even to say that you can't say anything about God is to say something about God. It's to say that you can't say anything about him, which is to say something. This gave me a very, very big headache, as you can imagine. And one of the conclusions I came to, and you should recognize that we're all the product of the things we've read. We're all the product of the teachers that we've had. And therefore, even the things that we think we've come up with ourselves, and there'll be another case of this in a minute, they're there in the things we've read. And I think to a great extent, what I'm about to tell you is there in this quote from To Heal the Fractured World, and it's there in the key idea of the dignity of difference. The point is this. Rav Yosef Albo, a great 15th century Jewish philosopher from Spain, 1400s, he said that God has an infinite number of properties, but we can't know them all. Now that places us in a very difficult situation. Imagine that you're reading a book, right? And you have to write a book study about a certain character in a book. Well, until you finish the book, you should be very careful about what you say, because it could be like anybody who's read the first Harry Potter book, for example. It could be the case that the villain turns out not to be a villain at all. And it's not that you were wrong about the things that that Snape was doing, Professor Snape, I think that's his name. It's not that you were wrong about the things that he was doing. You had the facts, but you didn't have all of the facts. And if you had all of the facts, then your understanding of the character of Snape would have been very, very different. Well, lahavdil, perhaps we're in the same position about God. We know something about God, but we can never know everything about God. And that should make us feel very humble, because perhaps the things we don't know about God would shed a very different light upon the things that we do know about God. And therefore, when we do systematic philosophy of religion, systematic Jewish theology, we have to reconcile that, you know what? Anything that we could say about God can at best be something like a guess. And part of what I wanted to say about the rabbinic negative theology of the medieval times was the following. I think what they were doing is they were trying to show you that actually, if you follow all of the things you believe about God, you'll be led into a contradiction. And what that should lead you to become is humble. So what Maimonides is saying on my reading is, oh, do you know what? I've got proof that God exists. It's called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. But one of the things that follows from the cosmological argument is that you can't actually speak about God. Oh no, there's a contradiction. I've been speaking about God, but my argument for God's existence says I can't speak about God. Oh, what should I do? And I think the answer is be humble. When your own views lead you into contradiction, what that might help you to do is to see that you've only got a partial glimpse of something. You don't yet have the whole truth. And therefore, part of, I think, the story of medieval negative theology was about intellectual humility. And Rabbi Sacks has that same intellectual humility, and it's rooted in Judaism being a future-oriented faith. We don't yet have the entire truth because the Jewish journey isn't yet complete. So I want to read from you a quote from a different thinker before I wrap up this little section. It's from a thinker called Michael Wishograd, who was another great Jewish philosopher, a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who passed away just a few years ago. He said, to think is to shed light. It's to create a limited clearing. But the clearing is always surrounded by darkness. And it's easy to forget the darkness and to see only the light. It's easy, so to speak, to concentrate on what you know and to forget that there's loads more that you don't know. This is so, but Jewish thought cannot lose sight of the darkness, says Wishograd. This is so because Jewish thought is on the way. The Jewish story is incomplete. We do not see the outcome. It is not a question of uncertainty. The redemption has been promised by God and therefore it will come. Rabbi Sacks, as you'll see in Rav Noam's post from Alex Israel about the cancer battles he's had in the past, is a man with a resolute faith in God. It's not that he has a lack of certainty. So as Wishograd says, it's not a question of uncertainty. The redemption has been promised by God and therefore it will come. But because it has not yet come, the story of Israel is still happening and cannot therefore be laid before us as an object of contemplation, because faith lies in the darkness of the future, and therefore no logos of God, no science of God, no theology is possible, at least not to man, and not now, says Wishograd. If you take seriously Rabbi Sacks's view that that Judaism is a future-oriented faith, it follows that we don't yet have our hands on all of the truth. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be dogged in our commitment to Judaism. I could quote here a piece of Hasidic Torah from the Ishbitzer Rebbe. Rav Noam and I both learnt under Rav Herzl Hefter, who is a great student of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. The Ishbitzer Rebbe said, he was Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner of the mid-19th century. He lived in Ishbitz in Poland. He takes the line from Sefer Vayikra, Im bechukotai telechu, if you walk in my ways. And the completion of the verse is, if you walk in my ways, then there'll be blessings. But the Ishbitzer says as follows, Im bechukotai telechu, if you walk in my ways. When you walk in my ways, you should do it with the outlook of the word if. The word if brings in doubt. The word if brings in humility. Maybe I'm wrong. When you walk in God's ways, do so humbly. Do so, says the Ishbitzer, with the recognition that God's will is infinite and therefore inestimable. And because inestimable, even the Torah that you have can only be at best an approximation of God's will. Now, of course, it's the best approximation that we have. It's the language in which God spoke to the Jews. But it's a language, and it's a human language, and therefore it's limited, and therefore there's room for humility. We can live with faith in its truth, recognizing that it's not complete, recognizing that it's somehow partial. And that means, yes, you can see that a Muslim person might have a relationship with God too, and then a Christian person might have a relationship with God too. That doesn't mean our disagreements can just be washed away. I don't think Rabbi Sacks would say that, from the Christian point of view, Jesus was the Messiah, but from the Jewish point of view, he wasn't. No, either he was or he wasn't. But nobody has a monopoly on religious truth, because there's no such thing as a monopoly on religious truth until the story is finished. And the story isn't finished. And in fact, that's one of the great messages that Rabbi Sacks thinks Judaism teaches to the world, because Judaism is fundamentally a future-oriented faith. So that was the second element I wanted to share with you of Rabbi Sacks's thought, which I think has made a big impact, has been very distinctive, sometimes misunderstood, but I think is powerful. Noam, I think there's some questions.
There's a question. Let me know if you how you'd want to take this. So Stephen Shaw writes, if I don't know anything about God, that means I know something about God, meaning you know nothing about God.
Mm-hmm.
So, Sam, if one of your students writes an exam, I know nothing about the subject, what mark would you give to that answer? Presumably, some mark is appropriate as the student.
Yes, I think some mark is appropriate. That's right. These are the paradoxes into which we fall when we say that there's such a thing as the ineffable, that which we can't talk about. As Frank Ramsey said, you can't talk about what you can't talk about, and you can't whistle it either. What can't be said, and you can't whistle it either. Well, no, I think actually sometimes Judaism is the attempt to whistle that which can't be said. And the rabbis, on my reading, the rabbis were very aware of these contradictions. They knew what they were saying, They knew that they were saying that, hold on a minute, there's a God that we can say nothing about, but you've just said something about him. They were trying to show us that theology leads us into certain contradictions. And that doesn't mean that theology is false. It means that our knowledge is partial. And that even though it's partial, it could still be good enough to hold on to dearly. Like the Ispitzer is saying, walk in God's ways, but walk in God's ways with the outlook of the word if. Do it with humility. And ultimately, I think that was the main call of the dignity of difference. So the third thing I want to look at is a mea culpa. I mean, in my book on the principles of Judaism, I do thank Rabbi Sacks dearly, and in fact, he has a sentence on the back page where he says something nice about it, which was very kind of him. And I thank him for his influence, but I had forgotten, I think, that he had said what I'm about to read to you. And I have basically said exactly the same thing in my book. And I'm sure that I got it from here without realizing. And if I get a second edition of my book, I'll put a footnote in it. It just goes to show the extent to which Rabbi Sacks' influence on me is kind of all pervasive. I read this week on Parshat Bereshit in his series Covenant and Conversation. This is in the print volume on the Book of Genesis. So in my book, one thing I talk about is belief in the creation of the world, and how the Jewish belief in creation with the world interacts with our scientific knowledge of cosmology and the beginnings of the universe. Now, Pope Pius was of the opinion that the Big Bang Theory was a tremendous victory for theists, because before the Big Bang Theory, the regnant worldview had said, and this is what Einstein had thought, that the universe had existed forever with no beginning and no fundamental changes in its nature and in its shape and its size. This view is called the steady state theory. It was in fact pretty much identical to the theory of Aristotle. But then along came a priest called Lemaitre, who solved these equations of Einstein called the field equations in such a way as to suggest that the universe was expanding. And Einstein was very perturbed, and he knew that because Lemaitre was a priest, maybe there was some hidden theological agenda. You see, if the universe is expanding, well, press rewind, and it would seem to imply there must have been a beginning, a first point from which everything tumbled outwards, the Big Bang. But then Hubble, in the early 1920s, had empirical verification. He looked out of his tremendously large telescopes, the best telescopes available at the time, and he was able to prove, because of the Doppler effect and the red shift, he was able to prove that deep space objects are indeed, all of them, running away from us and from each other as fast as they, so to speak, can. The universe is expanding, and Einstein ate his proverbial hat and became a believer in the Big Bang Theory. And along comes Pope Pius and says, you see, there was a beginning. There was a moment at which God said, let there be light. And there was a great bang, and the universe came. And if there was a beginning, there must have been a creator. And therefore, the Abrahamic creation narrative has been substantiated. Well, in my book, I discuss the pros and cons of that argument. I'm not entirely convinced that that's a great argument. But one of the problems that emerges, of course, is the age of the universe. You see, on contemporary cosmology, the universe seems to be around 14 billion years old, not the 5,800 and, where are we now? 5,802 years of the creation according to the Jewish count. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory was skeptical about the methods used to date fossils. And for that reason, he said, well, only if the current dating apparatus are reliable do we get a result that the world and later on the universe is that old. But they're probably wrong. We should just, stick with the rabbinic consensus of a young universe. And if it turns out that it really would have taken millions of years for these fossils to fossilize, then perhaps God just put them under the ground as a test to test our faith. Now, one of my other great intellectual heroes, apart from the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rabbi Sacks, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of course, had a huge influence over Rabbi Sacks personally. But another of the great influence over my life and my thought is Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell has this thing called the 5-minute hypothesis, where he says, for all we know, the entire universe was created 5 minutes ago. There's nothing you could do to disprove it, because it could be that just because you have memories, maybe you were created, maybe I was created 5 minutes ago as a 37-year-old man with lots of false memories of the past. And maybe the world was created with signs of antiquity, signs of old age. But that doesn't mean it wasn't created 5 minutes ago. But you see, the problem with that hypothesis from a theistic point of view is it renders God deceptive. Right? Why did God put those fossils under the ground? To test our faith? Well, aren't there enough tests of our faith that we need to add, some dinosaur bones? And how does it test our faith? Since plenty of religious people have believed that the world is ancient and still the creation of God. So it's not a very good test of our faith, even if that's what it was aimed to be. The question that emerges is, how is God not being deceptive by placing us in a world that has these signs of tremendous age, and then revealing a Torah to us, which seems to tell us that the earth is young? Says Rabbi Sacks, to understand a book, one needs to know to which genre it belongs. Is it a history or legend, chronicle or myth? To what question is it an answer? A history book answers the question, what happened? A book of cosmology, be it science or myth, answers the question, how did it happen? Rabbi Sacks is commenting here on a surprising comment of Rashi, quoting an earlier figure, and there's debate as to exactly who he was, Rabbi Yitzchak, may have even been Rashi's father, maybe the teacher of Rashi. Rabbi Yitzchak asks at the beginning of the Torah, why does God start the Torah with the creation? Shouldn't he have started with the first mitzvah? What Rabbi Isaac is succinctly saying, according to Rabbi Sacks, in his enigmatic question, is that if we seek to understand the Torah, we must read it as Torah, meaning law, instruction, teaching, guidance. That's what the word Torah means. Torah is an answer to the question, how shall we live? That is why Rabbi Yitzchak raises the question as to why it doesn't begin with the first mitzvah given to Israel. Because Rabbi Yitzchak understands what genre the book is. He carries on. Torah is not a book of history, even though it includes history. It is not a book of science, even though the first chapter of Genesis, as the 19th century sociologist Max Weber points out, is the necessary prelude to science. Why? Because it represents the first time people saw the universe as the product of a single creative will, and therefore as intelligible rather than capricious and mysterious. I'll just put in parentheses here what I think Rabbi Sacks is saying. Even though the Torah isn't a science book, you shouldn't think that monotheism and the lessons of the Bible are irrelevant to science. They're not irrelevant to science. It's only once you believe that the world should be explicable that science becomes a worthwhile project to begin with. It's only once you believe that the universe submits to a single set of rules does the scientific endeavor get off the ground. Monotheism was the belief that the world submits to a single will, and therefore that the world should be understandable, and therefore that the world should submit to science-like laws. So it's not as if the message of the Torah is irrelevant to science, as Rabbi Sacks, but nonetheless, the Torah is not a science book. Rather, it is first and last a book about how to live. Everything it contains, not only mitzvot, but also narratives, including the narrative of creation itself, is there, and this is dynamite stuff, solely for the sake of ethical and spiritual instruction. So you're reading the Torah next week and you see these long lists of genealogy or genealogy from Noach to Avram. You're like, who cares who this guy begat that guy, who begot this guy, who lived? Every line is there for your ethical edification. And if you haven't squeezed out an ethical message, you haven't got it yet. Because it's not a history book. It's not a book of genealogy. It's a Torah. It's there, everything in it is there solely for the sake of ethical and spiritual instruction. For Jewish ethics is not confined to law. It includes virtues of character, general principles, and role models. It is conveyed not only by commandments, but also by stories telling us how particular individuals responded to specific situations. History as a genre didn't really exist until Thucydides. And before Thucydides, there wasn't really a genre that was called history. So when extremist theologians with a literalist bent open the Torah and say, oh, the world was created 5,000 years ago, 6,000, they are being anachronistic because they are treating the Torah as a science book. But there were no such things as science book when the Torah was revealed. They are treating the Torah as a natural history, but there was no such thing as natural history when the Torah was revealed. We're not being anachronistic when we say, hold on a minute, why are you taking this literally? Because the new atheists, they hate it when people like me say these things. They say, oh, you keep changing the rules of the game. You know, now we've proven the world isn't really 6,000 years. You'll say, okay, let it be billions of years. You keep changing the rules of the game. No, I'm not changing the rules of the game. I'm saying the Torah was never a history book, and only anachronism could ever lead you to think that it was. Rabbi Sacks is making that point for a very different reason to me. I was making the point in order to show how God's Torah, in conjunction with the world in which we live, displaying signs of antiquity, needn't render God a deceptive God at all. Because the point of the creation narrative wasn't to teach us exactly what happened and when. It's not the point. If God gives you a fictional story, you still better pay attention to it because God wrote it. If God gives you a myth, you still better pay attention to it because God gave it to you. And if God gives you a Torah, which is a genre all of its own, a genre which includes myth, it includes history, it includes things which are important to the scientist, but fundamentally is a genre that's about our ethical and spiritual development, then we better pay attention to it. But not because of the science or history that it teaches, because that's to look at the Torah under the wrong lens. That's the reason, you know, I was saying these things, but I think the reason Rabbi Sacks was saying these things, and I think this animates all of his work, is that theology, history, science, sociology, there are so many fields of study that interest Rabbi Sacks, that he knows about, that he's read about. But fundamentally, the thing that matters to him most is ethics, which takes us back to the beginning of this talk, which is to say, if you come up with a Judaism that doesn't care about the plight of vulnerable non-Jews, then you are very seriously wrong. And Rabbi Sacks's great contribution to Jewish literature and life has been to animate and illuminate the ethical heart of the Jewish tradition and its practices. So that's all I had to say today. Those were the three themes, and a little bit about how Rabbi Sacks has touched my own life and work. Noam.
So thank you. I mean, that was, so beautifully presented and so clear-headed, and I think really a really powerful exploration of how Rabbi Sacks's vision and thinking has influenced your own thought. I see a question here, and then we can maybe open up for further questions. We have a couple minutes for you. You got the whole rest of the day, but it's late for people here, and so please, of course, do not feel that one needs to stay if you don't want to. But if you've got a couple minutes, maybe we'll just field some questions. So we got a question from Jonathan Boimel, who says, if Judaism is a future-oriented religion, does that imply that we should discount the future at a relatively low rate and pay greater attention to issues such as global warming? So this goes back to your second point.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think if I had to compare Rabbi Sacks to any figure in the Jewish kind of intellectual firmament that preceded him, it would be to Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, because Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch was a tremendous communicator of Jewish values and ethics in the vernacular of his age. And one of the things that's most striking about Rabbi Hirsch's work is that, first of all, it beats a very strong ethical heartbeat. Everything comes down to ethics. But secondly, he was in a sense the first ecological rabbi. He was tremendously concerned with the effects over the environment of the industrialization that was occurring around him. And he spoke about this as a pressing concern for Jewish life. And yes, I think that Rabbi Sacks's message of a future-oriented faith means that Judaism needs to shake itself up and get active about causes like this. Rabbi Sacks in To Heal a Fractured World has something of a critique to level against his left and his right. To his left, he worries about people who only care about social activism and social justice, but they don't care about ritual, and they don't care about prayer, and they don't care about theology. For Rabbi Sacks, ritual, prayer, and theology are essential to human flourishing, and they're essential to the life well lived. But the critique he has to the people on his right are that there are a number of Orthodox Jews, sadly, who are very animated about protecting their halachic observances, but are much less animated about causes like global warming, causes about wealth inequality and poverty, causes beyond the immediate concern of Orthodox Jewry. And these are things that I think Rabbi Sacks calls us to be active around.
So we have a question here from Shani, and this is obviously your understanding of Rabbi Sacks' understanding. How does Rabbi Sacks see the role of the Gentile? As in the books and the writings of his that I have skimmed, he presents Judaism as the strongest truth. So what is there left for the nations of the world? And then I'm not sure exactly how that to live
I think in a sense, it's an unfair question, and the sense in which it's an unfair question is really illuminating. I hope it will be illuminating for you. I'll try and explain why I think it's unfair. Rabbi Sacks thinks of the Torah as the story of God's relationship with a single people, the Jewish people. Apart from the first few chapters, which talks about God's concern for all of humanity with his relationship with Adam and Eve, and later through Noah, God has a relationship with all of humanity, but primarily this book, the Torah, is about God's relationship with us. But Rabbi Sacks, like his predecessor in the seat of the chief rabbinate, Emanuel Jacopovitz, was not a believer in Jewish exclusivity. That is to say, as Rabbi Jacopovitz made explicit, God can have a relationship with other people too. his relationship with us is expressed through the Torah. Does that mean God doesn't have a relationship with other people or doesn't call upon people to do other things? In fact, Rabbi Jacopovitz even went so far as to say that God chose the British people to showcase parliamentary democracy and chose the American people to showcase parliamentary democracy with a plural, with an ethnically diverse citizenry. We sometimes reach our calling, sometimes we live up to our calling, sometimes we don't live up to our calling, but we might not be, so to speak, the only chosen people. But the job of Rabbi Sacks has been to articulate the Jewish voice in a global conversation. It's for other thinkers to articulate the non-Jewish voices. But I certainly think that Rabbi Sacks makes room for non-Jewish voices because of the intellectual humility at the heart of a theology that says that at no point in time does anybody have a monopoly on truth. Again, Rabbi Sacks is a spokesperson, a representative of the Jewish voice, which is a distinctive voice in that conversation. And he speaks to how unique, how valuable, how incomparable its message is. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other important messages and voices which will be unique in other ways.
Do we have any final questions? Maybe I'm gonna hold on a second. So we got a question from Heather. Many of my ultra-Orthodox friends are not interested in the environment because when Mashiach comes, God will repair the world entirely. How would you answer those people? I'm just going to cancel your sharing there just so people can see.
Okay, sure. Very nice. So I'll say, and I'll answer that, and I'll end with a little story. I think the problem with such people, from a Sacksian perspective, so to speak, is that they have mistaken the future for the present. The Messiah hasn't come yet. And that means that not only can we, not only must we be humble and recognize that we don't have the entire theological picture, but we also have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to make this world worthy of redemption. It will happen, but it won't happen without us. That's very much the view, it seems to me, of Rabbi Sacks, that the wrong response to the promise of the Messiah is quietism. Say, oh, well, we'll just wait until it happens. No, we are called to make it happen. That's what I would say to that. And I just want to end, based on the last question, with a story. Rabbi Sacks says that when he met with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe told him a parable, a mashal. He says, imagine that your job was to carry around cheap bags of coal, schlepping them around all day. So all you're ever doing is schlepping around heavy, burdensome, cheap rocks. That's your job. And then you're given a bag of rubies to look after. You might not be well equipped to look after them well because you're only used to lugging around kind of worthless lumps of coal. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said to Rabbi Sacks, other religions have rubies that are worth exploring. But if your Judaism feels like a sack of coals to you, then you're never going to appreciate the rubies that other people have. So first of all, we have to transform what seems to us to be a bag of coals, the burden of our own tradition, and to see it for the bag of rubies that it really is. And only then, perhaps, will we be well placed enough to appreciate the rubies of others.
So I want to thank you, Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens, for
thank you, Rabbi.
For illuminating for us the many rubies, the many gems within our tradition, according to your wonderful perspective, but obviously deeply influenced by the incredible work of Rabbi Sacks. May he continue to live at Me'avestrim in great health and great vitality, and continue to lead us and to guide us. And so that's really why we are here. And I thank you for taking the time to really inspire us. What a beautiful share that you've
Thank you.
delivered.
We have so much more to learn from him.
There's no question. And so you're going to come back next week, of course, at this. No, I'm just kidding. We'll get you back at some point, please, God.
Thank you. Thank you, Adnan.
Where can people find out, besides the website and, of course, the book? I assume that's available on Amazon or wherever you can.
Yeah, I suppose my website is the best way to know what's going on in my life. That's samlebens.com. I have, last year I completed a cycle of weekly Divrei Torah on the Parsha. People are interested, it's there, samlebens.com.
It's awesome stuff. I can say, just bringing together lots of, as you would have seen this evening, bringing together lots of different perspectives, and so much continued hatzlacha to you and to your family and to everything that you're doing. Stay healthy and stay safe over there. And we look forward to that future time, though may it come very, very soon, that we are back together in Eretz Yisrael and in Ir HaKodesh. And once again, we pray for a Refua Shelemah of Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba, and everyone let's just continue to learn, continue to do good deeds, pick up some of Rabbi Sacks' many books, check out his stuff online, and please God, we should hear good things. And I thank you again so much. And everyone, thank you so much for taking time this evening, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.